Welcome. Today, we're going to unpack a really profound and honestly often overlooked paradox from post-colonial India. We're drawing from the work of sociologist Virginius Xaxa, and it's a story all about promises and the very real price that came with them.
Just think about that for a second. This isn't some philosophical thought experiment. For millions of India's tribal people, who are also known as Adivasis, this was their reality. The very process of being brought into the new nation-state came at an absolutely devastating cost.
So to really get this, we have to rewind the clock. Right after India's independence in 1947, the brand new state had this huge task ahead of it. How do you build one unified nation out of this incredibly diverse patchwork of people? And for its tribal communities, it made a big promise, a constitutional promise, to protect and empower them. The state's game plan was this clear, three-pronged policy. You can think of it like this. First, there was a protective shield, meant to guard tribal land and culture. Then, there was a mobilizational strategy, using reservations to open doors in politics and jobs. And finally, a developmental plan, with all sorts of programs for social and economic well-being. Looked great on paper, right? A really comprehensive and fair approach.
And this wasn't just talk. These weren't vague ideas. They were literally baked into the Constitution. You had laws to stop land from being taken away, special administrative zones, and a solid 7.5% reservation quota for seats in politics, schools, and government jobs. The whole point was to protect the absolute bedrock of tribal life, their land and their voice in the new India.
But, and this is a huge but, here is where the paradox just slams into you. While the state was offering citizenship and protection with one hand, its other hand was pushing this massive agenda of national development. And those two goals, they were on a collision course.
Yep, that promise to protect tribal lands ran smack into the reality of building a modern nation. The new state desperately needed resources. We're talking minerals, water, land, and, well, a whole lot of that wealth just happened to be in the very territories where tribal communities had lived for centuries.
And the numbers here are just staggering. Get this. During this period, tribal communities made up only about 8% of India's total population, but they accounted for a full 40% of all people who were displaced by big projects like dams, mines, and factories. 40%. The scale is just hard to wrap your head around. Over 8.5 million tribal people, uprooted from their homes, their farms, their ancestral lands, all in the name of national development. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect. For them, it was the main effect. So what about those protective laws we just mentioned? Well, even with them on the books, almost 1 million acres of tribal land were officially transferred away through things like fraud and coercion. It just goes to show you, those legal safeguards, no matter how well-intentioned, often ended up being little more than paper shields against the powerful forces of development.
And Xaxa just nails the heart of the issue with this quote. The state basically said, we'll give you political rights, the right to vote, to hold office, but in return, it took the economic rights to the land and resources the tribes had always controlled. It was a trade, but it was a deeply unequal one.
Okay, so the protective laws often failed. What about that other promise, the one about empowerment? Well, even when Adivasis tried to use those new systems, like job reservations, they found out pretty quickly that the playing field was anything but level. This data from 1995 tells such a powerful story. Both scheduled castes, who were historically known as Dalits, and scheduled tribes had reservation quotas. But just look at these numbers. Scheduled tribes had a 7.5% quota, but they held less than 3% of the top-level Group A jobs. That's way behind their scheduled caste counterparts. So why? What was going on here? Xaxa's explanation is that it all comes down to their completely different starting points in history. See, scheduled castes were always part of the mainstream society, even though they were segregated and faced horrible discrimination. That proximity meant they were at least exposed to how the dominant culture worked. On the other hand, scheduled tribes had always lived in relative isolation, and now that very isolation became a huge barrier to navigating and tapping into these new opportunities the state was offering. So you can imagine, faced with losing their land on one side and hitting systemic barriers on the other, tribal communities didn't just stay silent. Of course not. They organized, they fought back, and they developed this powerful new political awareness that sparked movements all across the country.
And this resistance wasn't just one static thing. It evolved. It started with early rebellions against the British. Then, by the 60s, it morphed into demands for their own autonomous regions. The 70s and 80s were all about mass protests against being displaced, and today it's grown into a sophisticated challenge to the state's whole idea of development.
The fight was happening on so many fronts at once. It was a struggle for land and forests, the very heart of their existence. It was a struggle to protect their unique cultures and languages, a struggle for political self-determination, and maybe the most important one of all, a struggle to challenge the very definition of progress that was costing them their world.
And some of these movements became global symbols of this fight. The Narmada Bachao Andolan, which means the Save the Narmada movement, is the perfect example. It put a human face on the massive cost of these giant projects and literally forced the entire world to stop and pay attention.
And that brings us to the final fundamental question that Xaxa's work leaves us with, a question that is just as urgent today as it was then. If your model of national development systematically kicks the original inhabitants of a country off their land, who is that development really for? It forces us all to ask, what's the true price of progress, and who is being made to pay it?